Well, I've had a request or two or three or more from many of my followers to talk a little bit more about Old Boulder. Um, I didn't really think there's that much to talk about, but I guess there probably is. I grew up 40 miles from Boulder. It was two-lane road back then. There was no really direct route. You had to go straight south on a U.S. highway from my town until you got exactly 9 miles east of Boulder, and then you turned right for 9 miles and entered upon the realm of fantasy and things such as this. It was a very pretty town back in the 50s. Uh, the architecture was pretty consistent. The university was very consistent. It had the same architecture. It was Italian Renaissance architecture. And it had a very interesting group that sort of ran the town. Um, the town was uh, dry. You couldn't get a drink in Boulder. They did have 3-2 beer that you could buy if you wanted to drink beer. And that was sort of like a near beer. It was half the alcohol content of regular beer. And there were a few places in Boulder that served it. And their clientele mainly consisted of people associated with the university, both undergraduate, graduate student, and a few faculty occasionally. One institution was the Sink, and that used to be called the Sunken Gardens, and then a guy named Herb Kavar bought it and turned it into the Sink. In the 60s, it became quite a good music venue, which stretched into the 70s. In the university area called the Hill, there was another bar called Tulagi's, and they called that the Tool. One local group started there was a group called the Astronauts. Boulder was famous for training astronauts. Back in the late 50s, it was also the locus of the United States Air Force Academy until their campus in Colorado Springs was completed. And it had a lot of federal institutions. The National Bureau of Standards was located here, for instance. It was supposedly an institution that developed standard weights and measurements for everything. And weights and measurements have always been an important thing in trade. The British and a lot of the European areas were very big on weights and measurements. If you go to the Crime Museum, for instance, in Rothenburg, they have pictures of pig masks that people who cheated on weights and measurements, such as butchers and bakers and mill operators, people like this, if they shorted their customers, they would have to wear a pig mask for being greedy. I imagine there's a lot of industrialists and big capitalists that are glad that those days are gone. Another thing that was in Boulder was, of course, the University of Colorado. That was the main industry here. And it was sort of an idyllic little place. There was a place about about 300 yards from the campus called the Timber Tavern. If you wanted hard liquor, you had to go outside of the town. Right outside of town was the Harvest House, and also another place called the Lamp Post. Downtown Boulder had a bunch of 3-2 beer places, Broken Drum, Tom's Tavern, the Rendezvous, etc. And in fact, I saw Judy Collins there perform when she was in school here. She performed at the Rendezvous, I believe. And there were a few scattered restaurants, and halfway between the Hill area, which is where the university was, in downtown, was a place called the Gondolier, and 60 years later it's still operating, or 70 years later, I guess, which is kind of unusual for any kind of a restaurant, I think. In any event, you had these things operated in Boulder. The town at that time was about 25,000. The university was 10,000, and it felt overwhelmingly large at that time. It was highly politicized in the 60s. There wasn't any other industry, and there was a big group of conservatives and a large group of liberals fighting each other. You could go outside of town, south of town, to Rocky Flats, where they made nuclear bombs, and see signs that said, "Get the U.S. out of the red UN," and another big, large billboard that said, "Impeach Earl Warren." And that seemed to have been pretty much the mainstream political thought in Boulder back then, in the 50s and 60s. Eisenhower was president when all of this started, and later Kennedy was there. And Kennedy's first year was the year that I started at the University of Colorado. I didn't do too well. It was kind of a bad experience for me. I was younger and I got out of high school young and discovered beer and parties and all kinds of things like that I'd never ever participated in before, and it was new, and it was kind of fun, and consequently I had to leave before the first semester was over. I drank too much beer and ran out of money and a few other things. So I decided to go to University of Denver and enroll in a music conservatory where I could get paid to go to school, which is what I did. But I can remember the first impressions. First impressions of a 16-year-old in Boulder was that of fright, I guess would be the best way to describe it. Everything sort of overwhelmed me. All those students running around, there was people pushing you to join fraternities, sororities, etc. There was people to get you to go beer drinking with them. Some hazing by upper division students, but mainly it was just a large institution. And where I came from, they had grades 7 through 12 in the same building, and all of a sudden I'm turned loose with 7,000 or 8,000 undergraduates and a couple thousand graduate students, and had no clue of how to behave, what to do, what courses to take, what courses were about even. I was really unprepared to go there. But I was always interested in various political things and was observant of a lot of things going on that my fellow students probably weren't. Um, One of the things that was very curious was a group called the Minutemen. They were patrolling the Platte River, which is very flat, from attack by Russian submarines. They were also drilling and always practicing for the commie invasion. Um, there was a general that had been the head of NATO. General Walker was his name, and he got fired for indoctrinating or trying to brainwash NATO troops, and ended up at Fort Collins at Colorado State University in charge of the ROTC program. And there were a bunch of really pro-military people in the Fort Collins area, and that's the area that I came from. And in fact, I was very naive then. My father had been a commander of the Veterans of Foreign Wars. He had been a big honcho in the Masonic Lodge and in the Elks Lodge. And growing up, my life experience revolved around the various functions of the Masonic Lodge, the Elks Lodge, and of course, every weekend we had some function at the VFW. So in some ways, I was very sheltered and really wasn't very aware politically or socially or ill-prepared generally. And I got there and I met people from the East Coast and the West Coast and got to interact with them. There were all kinds of students from all over the world that I'd never seen, from countries I'd never heard of. And it was just a cascade of stimuli that I had to try to sort out. And on top of that, you had this war going on between one of the professors at the university named Alice Garber, who was the faculty advisor for a group called the Young People Socialist League, and another one named Rozek, and he was the conservative voice of the campus, funded by the Coors family and various others. So the campus was very, very conservative by and large. There was a big contingency of ROTC people there who used to get a flat top or a crew cut haircut every week. There were a lot of immigrants there from Cuba, the rich Cubans, a lot of people from various European countries that also had a lot of money. There was a lot of wealth generated, people from generated wealth attending school there. They could afford to go to the Tulagis or the Sink every night if they so chose. I got to stand by and watch. And again, it was very enlightening. That's the first time I ever heard the term trust funder. It was also the first time I'd ever seen a black student. And there was one who lived next door to me in the dorm named Elwin Caldwell Jr., who was really a great guy. His father owned the Rossonian Tavern in Denver, which I used to hang out later when I was going to the conservatory. They had after-hours jam sessions there among the jazz musicians that used to come to Denver and play. Denver was kind of an interesting place too. Then it was under 500,000 population. There was live music at just about every bar on Colfax Avenue. Um, a lot of the merry pranksters would stop and stay at the boarding house that I was living at on their way between Chicago or New York and the West Coast. So I got to meet some of them, and that was kind of a good experience. Um, the music scene was really big both in Boulder and in Denver, and it was a good thing to belong to. And it was, where my circle of friends were and where my social life was. And at that time, I was sort of, I guess the term back then would have been beatnik. I used to go drink coffee with Allen Ginsberg when he was at the boarding house, and his friends. There was a guy from Colorado that was with that crew. He was living at the boarding house because he was on probation, had to report to a probation officer every 2 weeks or 3 weeks or thereabouts. And there were just all kinds of interesting people, all kinds of interesting musicians, all kinds of poets. And of course, we sat around coffee shops drinking coffee, and a few would-be poets would write would-be poetry. And that was, back in those days, what they called the beatnik era. Vietnam hadn't started up, and things were very quiet. Then all of a sudden, Kennedy got shot. And I think Kennedy got shot when I was back at the University of Colorado then. I was a junior. And it was really disheartening because most of us were enthusiastic when Kennedy got elected. And most of the people that I hung around with, or my friendship group, wanted to do good things for our country. Join Peace Corps or things such as that, do something good. The business schools were almost non-existent in our minds. Nobody went to business schools. We wanted to be social workers, lawyers, doctors, aid workers, people like that. A lot of my classmates went off to the Peace Corps, and that was the beginning of what ended up in Boulder to be the so-called hippie movement. And we'll have more on that in the next episode.